to start to say good morning and welcome you to this third scientific conference for Understanding Society. The next 3 days are packed with some really interesting talks and presentations and workshops, so I hope that you'll find something that's of value to you during the time. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Michaela Benzeval and I'm the new Director of Understanding Society, and I've been in the job for 21 days, so I'm just getting started. So this is an exciting time to be taking over Understanding Society. The value of the study is just taking off as we have 4 waves of data in the archive. And what's really good is that somebody else, Nick Buck, kind of did all the hard work to get us to where we are today. Wave 5 has just finished field work and we're preparing the data for release later in the year. Wave 6, 7 and the immigrant and ethnic minority boost samples are in the field at the moment. The 7th wave of the innovation panel has just been deposited and will be available in the next few weeks. And to date, we've had over 55 different experiments conducted in the innovation panel, which are helping to shape how we run the main study today. We have completed 3 associated studies, which are studies that researchers propose and design and fund themselves. And there'll be one of them presented later on the conference around risk-taking. So go along and listen to that and hear about it. Our 3rd Insights publication of findings from the study will be published in November, and we're going to do that alongside an event at the Festival for Social Sciences. So if you want to kind of find out more about that, do look on our website. We're currently in the process of bidding for waves 9 to 11 of the study. And we've been asked to bid under different funding scenarios. So I can't really say much practically about what it is that we're going to be doing, because they vary quite considerably. But there are some key features that I thought it was worth drawing your attention to and identifying parts of the conference in which you can engage with us about it. So first of all, we've identified topic champions who will work in a range of different topics that we think are priorities for the study to ensure we have a really good balance between longitudinal consistency and emerging agendas. And on Wednesday at 2 o'clock, we're going to have an event about the youth questionnaire. So we're thinking about whether the youth questionnaire at the moment has that right balance between longitudinal consistency, whether we're asking the right topics for the emerging agendas in youth research. So that will be in here at 2 o'clock. So do come along and talk to us and tell us how you think we should be developing that part of the study. Secondly, whatever funding scenario we have in the future, we'll be moving much more to a mixed mode way of delivering the data. And we feel quite confident doing that, given all the research that's been done on the innovation panel. And during the survey methodology parallel sessions, you'll be able to hear some of that research about the effects of mixed mode on attrition and some of the ways that we can address that. And if you want to know more, then please talk to our survey team. John Burton there is the Associate Director of Surveys, but the rest of the team are around and at the drop-in centre, so you can ask about some of those things. Thirdly, we want to think about collecting data in new ways, using new technology and innovation. Annette Yekla, did I get that right? Annette Yekla, I can't do all my pronunciation. Annette Yekla, our Associate Director of Innovation, is leading on some projects thinking about how we collect new kinds of data on household finance. So if you want to kind of talk more about that, please go and chat with Annette. As well as thinking about how we collect data, we want to do a lot more work around how we support researchers to use the data. So yesterday, some of you were at some of the specialist training programs we ran on the biomarker data and using weights. And during the conference, there will be some workshops. So this afternoon, Paul Clark is running a workshop on the challenges of making most of the household level data in a longitudinal context. And tomorrow morning, Meena Kumari is holding a 2-part workshop on the use of genetics data. I mentioned a little while ago that we're having drop-in sessions at the conference. So they're on Wednesday and Thursday at 10:30 in this room. And different people from Understanding Society will be here to answer any questions you have about the study, or if you just want to come and talk to us about ways you think we can improve things. Finally, the final theme of our future work is around putting a lot of emphasis on generating and disseminating impact from the study. And we've established a policy unit a year ago to lead on this work, and it's featured at the conference in a number of ways. So with colleagues, Raj Patel, Impact Fellow, has produced a number of impact posters. And if you go into the poster room, which is just behind the registration desk, they're the posters that are immediately in front of you when you go in there. The policy and impact team will be available in the drop-in sessions if you want their advice or just to talk to them about some of the things you're doing around generating impact. And today, after lunch, with colleagues from Closer, there'll be a workshop on understanding and generating impact. The conference, of course, is mainly about giving you, the researchers, an opportunity to present, hear, and discuss your research findings. And so we're delighted that the conference is going to be started with a plenary lecture by Sara Arber, using the Understanding Society data on her research on ageing and sleep. And on Thursday, our plenary lecture will be given by David Bell, who's using the Understanding Society data to simulate the effect of Scottish devolution on tax and benefits. There are more than 70 papers being presented through the parallel sessions, but given there's some changes that have happened, it's really important to use the programme that you got at registration than the one that's in the abstract book to find out where the presentations you want to go to are. Papers for the conference were selected by our scoring abstracts, and on Thursday we'll be awarding prizes to the highest scoring PhD student and early careers researchers. As well as the workshops that I mentioned that are about helping support your use of Understanding Society data, we have 2 other workshops showcasing research based on other longitudinal studies. So on Wednesday afternoon, René Luthra is leading a workshop on new immigrants in Europe. And on Thursday, the ONS are leading a workshop around national longitudinal studies. We've got a number of research posters as well as the impact posters, which are available in the poster room behind registration throughout the conference. But there's 2 specific sessions at 3 p.m. today and tomorrow when the authors will be there to talk about their posters. Do go along and take a look, and we've put a slip in your conference packs for you to vote for the best poster, and we'll be awarding that on Thursday along with the other prizes. And then our final request is that there's an evaluation form in your pack, so do fill it in at the end of the conference so that we know what worked and what you liked and what you'd like us to do more of for next time. So now, to start this plenary lecture, I'd like to invite David Walker, who's going to chair it, to take the floor. So David is now the chair of the Understanding Society Governing Board from September. Oh no, not from September, from now. That's what we... David was a journalist working on The Times, an Independent and Guardian, and then he became chair of the ESRC Methods and Infrastructure Committee, which helped very much set up the framework for Understanding Society in its early days. He's a leading member of the Academy for Social Science and very prominent in the campaign for social sciences. And so we're really pleased to have David's insights helping us with Understanding Society. So I'd like to now hand over to David to start the conference and look forward to talking to as many of you as possible during the time about your use of Understanding Society and how we can make it better. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michaela, for that. I'm just going to say a few brief words, if I may, to introduce myself as chair of the governing board of USOC, and then introduce the main event, which is Sara Arber. It's been a few days of registration of change in the social science community for me. I went yesterday evening to the retirement party at King's College London of Denise Leavesley, who will be known to many of you here, a former alumna of the University of Essex and a mainstay of empirical social research in this country. And it was great to meet earlier today Nick Buck, the outgoing instigator and leader of USOC, who will remain obviously a mainstay of the Essex social science enterprise, and I'm sure remain deeply interested in the products of investigating households. And Heather too, who I've not seen for a little while. She's been down under for a while, but herself moving to a new role, she was telling us, here at the university, further, I have to say, cementing Essex's reputation as one of the leading UK social science universities. And of course, Michaela's arrival as principal investigator for a study with which my connection began some years ago when I was on the council of the Economic Social Research Council. And aided and advised by practicing social scientists, we determined that BHPS could be and should be expanded while retaining its core into a much more ambitious investigation of change in households. Now, probably, as Michaela said, my background is public affairs, journalism, policy, and my emphases necessarily are on the utilization of the work that you're doing to collect the data, curate the data, analyze the data. The next stage, I say, obviously is very important, which you will share with colleagues who come to you to use USOC data. And clearly the context within which policy is ongoing has changed mightily since Tony Blair uttered those words in 1999. The present government, to be fair, remains interested in social mobility. Present government social welfare policies clearly have changed largely, and so the way in which it might put to use findings about households and the position in households of people seeking employment clearly has changed. USOC was conceived by the SRC as a way of capturing the changes in the United Kingdom as it moved out of, hopefully, there was recession and the financial crash 2008. But here we are now, the present government saying we are successfully out of that, albeit still in an age of austerity. And the kind of things that USOC will find in households, in the changing position of people in households, in employment, depending on their various characteristics, will answer to, we hope, a different set of policy exigencies on the part of the present government. The value of that study, we must keep telling government, remains huge. Whether the project is to shrink the state, to make the state more effective, to change the welfare system, the knowledge base that is available through USOC surely should be valued deeply, even by an ideologically different government from the government which set the study going. Now, enough from me. It's my great pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker in the shape of Sara Arber, Professor of Sociology, co-director of the Centre for Research on Ageing and Gender, former president of the British Sociological Association, and known to me recently as, how shall I put this, an active and vocal member of the HEFKI panel for REF 2014 for sociology. I was present as a user assessor of impact, and Sarah's and her colleagues' discussions about how one does calibrate and recognize impact were extremely instructive. My great pleasure, Sara Arber.
Right. Well, thank you, David, for that introduction. I can't remember what my interventions were but in the REF panel, but it was a very interesting and important experience for the whole of the social science community, and I think it was great to have user assessors such as David there. Firstly, it's really my great pleasure to be here speaking as your opening speaker to the Understanding Society conference. And I'm very grateful for Michaela for inviting me. And it's very nice to kind of meet kind of old friends, not old, but people I have known for a number of years and here, and obviously meet new people as well. When I kind of was invited to this, I said, well, I use Understanding Society and various other data sets, but I actually haven't been using Understanding Society longitudinally, but I've done quite a lot of cross-sectional analysis. And I said, is that okay? Because obviously Understanding Society is for longitudinal. But I think it's actually very important to remember that actually it's an incredibly important, large, cross-sectional data set as well. And we need to look at the potential of that. So what I want to do today is actually look at 3 exemplars of some of my research using Understanding Society and kind of give you a taster of these 3 different areas. And they are to some extent interconnected. So firstly, I want to look at some aspects in relation to ageing, particularly the impact of recent government changes encouraging us all to work for longer. And to look in more detail at who is in paid employment, and self-employment in their late 60s. And if we're all being encouraged to work longer, what is the likely impact, for example, on gender inequalities and also other bases of inequality through people working into their late 60s and 70s? So that's the first area. Second area is looking at sleep. And I've been working on sleep for about getting on for 15 years, and it's a fascinating and important area of work, I think. And I've done quite a lot of qualitative work, but also some quantitative work using Understanding Society and some other data sets as well. So I want to look a little bit at an aspect of social inequalities in sleep, particularly some work which we've got being published in September, in fact, in terms of to what extent sleep or sleep problems or difficulties are a potential mediator of the link between marital status and health. So that's the second area. And the third area kind of, to some extent, brings these things together in some ways, which is looking at caregiving and sleep. And to what extent does caregiving impact on the carer's sleep? And does this impact differ for older people who are carers compared with working age carers? So that's the three areas I want. So my aim really is to demonstrate the value of USOC, especially for the very large sample size of USOC for robust analyses of what we might see as proportionately small subgroups. So that's the kind of my main goal. Right, so my first exemplar relates to ageing and relates to looking at some of the impact of the recent policy changes on employment and inequality for people in their late 60s. As I'm sure everybody knows, particularly women know, older women know, or midlife women know, that women used to get their state pension at the age of 60. And I was very fortunate. I got my state pension at 60, shows how old I am. My dear sister, who's 4 years younger than me, she's waiting till she's 63 and a half for her pension, and she hasn't got it yet. I've got a colleague at the university who's in her late 50s, and she's going to actually have to wait till she's 66 to get her pension. So in really quite a short space of time, there's been a really big change in women's eligibility for their state pension, going up to 65 by 2018, and then for both men and women, won't get their state pension till they're 66, and then it's going up to 67 for people, I think people are 53 now or thereabouts, in 2028. And then the plans are, given life expectancy is increasing, then we can carry on increasing state pension age forever. So longer working may be something which is going to be here for many people in this room and many people in our society and across Europe and other countries too. A third sort of policy change is the removal of the state of compulsory retirement age in 2011. So prior to that, people could be forced to retire at 65, and now it's people over the age of 65 have the same rights and security to employment as people below that. So that, again, that's part of, and that's a very good thing in many ways. It's removing age discrimination in that sense. But what are the implications of that? And to what extent, particularly when people are trying to get back into the labour market in their mid-60s or late 60s, is there ageism by employers? And is it more difficult for women? Is there what we call gendered ageism? So to work in the sort of job you want to work in your late 60s, is that more difficult for women than for men? So there are all these sorts of issues. And then there are all sorts of changes to pensions and reduction of defined benefit pensions, increasing defined contribution pensions, which are impacting, which I'm not going to talk about. So one of the things I want to look at is the implications of these various policy changes for nature and patterns of employment, self-employment, and inequalities in later life, particularly relating to gender. So just to kind of summarise what I've been trying to say, if I can get this pointer working, possibly not, but anyway, doesn't matter. Yeah, is that it? No. Okay, here we go. Yeah, okay. So that by 2020, it's going to be age 66 for your pension, and then 2028, 67, so people who are currently around 53. And then there are current policy discussions to raise the state pension age even further. But this kind of in line with increases in life expectancy. But this kind of increase in the state pension age seems to ignore the very well-known class inequalities, class differences in health and disability, which are particularly strong in ages in the 60s and late 50s, and therefore ability to work. So we know there are large class differences in life expectancy and geographical differences in life expectancy depending on where you work, where you live, sorry. But when we're thinking about ability to work, life expectancy is perhaps less important than what we would call healthy life expectancy. And government data from the ONS, which has looked at healthy life expectancy, shows huge differences in healthy life expectancy. There are just two examples here that for people who live in Richmond, the healthy life expectancy is 72 years. If you live on the other side of London in Tower Hamlets, healthy life expectancy in 56 years. So if the assumption is we all can carry on working into our mid-late 60s and later, then clearly if you're living in Tower Hamlets, the likelihood is you've already got very substantial levels of disability and your ability to work in many jobs would be really quite problematic. Whereas if you live in Richmond, clearly a very, very different situation. So I think we need to kind of look at who can work in their late 60s and look at to what extent we may be actually exacerbating inequalities in later life through these sorts of policies. So, implications of the increase in state pension age to 67 for men and women in the UK and beyond. The key issues is to what extent will older women and men work beyond the age of 65, and this will depend on a range of factors, particularly their health and class-related health inequalities. So if you haven't got good health, the likelihood is you won't be able to work beyond 65. Secondly, and particularly important for women, is caring responsibilities. So many people in their 60s are caring for a spouse. Often a spouse will be older because women marry men older than themselves. So there's considerable caring for partners for women in their late 60s. But in the 60s with people living longer, often women have got, or people have got parents in their late 80s and 90s and substantial caring responsibilities. And increasingly, women are called on to care for their grandchildren. So again, I've written a book on it called Contemporary Grandparenting, which looks particularly at almost the assumption now that younger women need to work to afford to pay the mortgage and so on when they've got children, and midlife women in their late 50s and 60s feel it's kind of their responsibility to care for the grandchildren, often on a regular basis, sometimes 3 or 4 days a week. But if women are caring for their grandchildren to support that younger generation being able to be in employment and afford to pay their housing and so on and so forth, then that obviously is handicapping them and really seriously impacting on their possibility of working themselves in their 60s. And then there's the issue of availability of jobs for people in their 60s and to what extent we've got ageism or gendered ageism in the labour market. So if people are working in their late 60s, we'll look at briefly what is the nature of this work and likely remuneration, and to what extent opportunity to work over the age of 65 will be reducing or increasing income and gender inequalities in later life. So it's particularly important, given the policy changes I've outlined, to look at these three sort of factors. Employment, as I said, to what extent men and women are working beyond state pension age, type of jobs they're in, to what extent they're employees or self-employed. Secondly, how is health related to being in employment or self-employed? And thirdly, income, what are the income consequences of continuing to work as an employee or self-employed? What are the levels of inequality related to different sources of income, and to what extent that differs by gender? And for this I'm going to be looking at Understanding Society, Wave 4, data collected in very recently, 2012-13, which has got a large sample of people 60 to 79, over 11,000, and therefore one can robustly analyse small subgroups like the 65 to 69 age group which are kind of this critical age for longer working, of which there are 3,400. And obviously, as we know, Understanding Society's got a whole range of questions on employment, health, social circumstances, income, etc., etc. So I'm firstly looking at to what extent women and men are working beyond 60 and 65. That's this very conventional sort of diagram, which just simply says the proportion who are working as employees or self-employed by gender and age. And what we can see, and I obviously have kind of inefficiencies on this pointer, but never mind, is that there's no kind of sudden cut-off of when people stop working. The blue bars are men, and from the age of 60 onwards, there's a clear decreased age by this little blip there in proportions working. So by the time you get to age 65, only about 27% of men are in the labour market. So it's gone down quite rapidly even before we get to the 65. For women, there's obviously lower levels of employment at each age, and again, that's kind of going down. But you've still got these substantial proportions, well, around 10% of people in their 70s, particularly men working. So if we look at the 60 to 64 age group, just over half of men are working, 53%, 44% of women. When we get to the 65 to 69 age group, 21% of men are working and 18% of women. One of the key factors is that the nature of the employment changes quite a lot. And I was actually surprised when I looked at this data. The pale blue bars are the proportion of people who are working who are self-employed. And in fact, for men in their late 60s and 70s, almost half of men who are in employment are self-employed. So that increases substantially, whereas in the early 60s, it's around 30%. So self-employment is terribly important when we're looking at working in the latter parts of life. And some of that is people who are self-employed and carry on being self-employed, less likely to stop, but others are people going into self-employment following leaving their previous jobs. And for women, it's almost 37% of women in the late 60s who are working are self-employed. So again, that's a substantial increase. So self-employment is actually very important to look at and distinguish from employees. When we're just looking at employees, as you'd expect, people are working, but there's a substantial reduction in hours of work. The dark blue bar is people working over 35 hours a week. So men in their late 60s, in fact, over half are still working full time. So it's not perhaps as rapid a reduction in hours as one might expect, particularly for men, that the bare majority of men in their late 60s are actually still working full time. But by the time you get to the 70s, men in their 70s working, it's less than 20%. And the increase in very short hours, under 16 hours, that's the paler blue bar, increases a lot when you get to the 70s. For women, the fall off is more rapid, and very few women working full time in their early 60s, and by the time you get to the late 60s, it's only about 12% women working full time. So it's very large reduction in full time work and substantial increase in short part time hours. 40% of women in the late 60s working under 15 hours a week, and over 60% in their 70s. Also, the type of work changes, and the type of pay and the work contract changes for older people. The dark blue bar is people who are salaried, and the pale blue is people who are hourly paid. So they're hourly paid, more likely to be on short-term contracts, much less security and less good, benefits in all sorts of ways. And again, by the time you get to the 70s, men, the vast majority, over 60%, are working as hourly workers rather than salary workers. And for women, that's even greater. By the time you get to women in their late 70s, it's nearer 80%. So employment of people changes. People are more likely to be working on hourly contracts, low-paid occupations, and when you look at it by occupations, more shop work and service sector work and so on, more precarious type of work. But on the other side, you've got people who are working in managerial profession as well. So you've got a bit of a kind of evidence of polarisation in the type of work later on. When we look at what predicts people working above 60, there are two factors which really stand out very strongly. One is health, as we'd expect, but it's just very, very dramatic. This is proportion who are employees by the three age groups, men and women, and the black bar is people who report excellent or very good health. The red bar is people who report poor or fair health, and about twice as many men are working or are employees if their health is excellent or very good compared with their poor. And that's the case whether we're looking at the early 60s, the mid 60s, and the gap is even greater in the 70s. So health is actually a really dominant factor in whether you're an employee and also if you're self-employed as well, but it's a slightly different sort of relationship for self-employed. We can look at this much more systematically using something like a logistic regression, and this is predicting people who are, their first bar A is an employee, and there's no gender difference, interestingly. This is just for people in their 65 to 69, so late 60s. Education has a substantial effect. The odds of, if you've got a degree of being employed, is 1.72 compared with no qualifications. But when we put in health for being employed, that actually, becomes non-significant, the education factor. But health is crucial. So, and both disability, limited long-standing illness, if you've got no limited long-standing illness, your odds of being an employee are twice as high as if you've got a limited long-standing illness. And simultaneously, self-assessed health is, you've got a huge gradient of odds going up to around 5 for very, very good or excellent health compared with poor health of being an employee, so very strong. When we look at self-employment, actually the education effect is even stronger. So people who are self-employed are more likely to be educated. So they've been educated jobs and so on. So the odds of being self-employed, if you've got a degree, about threefold compared with no qualification. And that remains even after we control for education, for health, and very strong impact of self-assessed health, odds of 9 for excellent health compared with poor health. Obviously you can jump at me and say, actually, being in employment actually may improve your health. So that's one of the issues which one would need to look at. Well, it's not unlikely to have an impact on disability, but subjective health, being in employment actually can be a positive thing. So that's, I think, a value of analysing understanding society longitudinally would be to actually tease out those factors. This is obviously just cross-sectional data and we can note it, but not look at that in further. Okay, so to just summarise my first part, which is looking at employment after the age of 60, what we see is polarisation in working above age 60, more part-time work, hourly work versus salaried work in sales and service sector, but there are also people who are working, obviously professionals, managers and so on. Much higher levels of self-employment among those above 65, and that both being employed or self-employed is closely linked to health status. So what I want to look at now is the implications of working longer for income and gender inequality. And I want to just focus on this 65 to 69 group because they're critical, where 21% of men are working and 18% of women, and very high levels of self-employment, as I mentioned. So just focusing on 65 to 69, I'm going to look at 3 sets of income. One is total income, firstly, from all sources, then looking at just income from employment, and then looking at income from self-employment. And these are just kind of normal sort of box and whisker plots of total income, all sources for people in the late 60s, men and women. And I've kind of summarised some of the key levels below. So median income total for all men, 65 to 69, is roughly 18,000. Women, it's about 10,000 a year. And a ratio, gender ratio, about 1.7. So men's income is about 70% higher than women's. But there's also a substantial dispersion, as you'd expect, of income, with the top 10% of men having income 42,000, lowest 25% about 12,000. So that ratio I've put down here is 3.4, the ratio between the top 10% of men's all income from all sources compared to the lowest 25%, and we can look at it from the top 1%, lowest 25% ratio 10, and we can compare it with men and women and so on. But anyway, Okay, when we look at the same thing for income from employment, that is, if for employees, what we find is substantially greater gender differences in the amount of income as an employee and substantially greater inequalities, i.e. range and dispersion. So as an employee, for people who are employees in the late 60s, the median for men, about 17,000, for women is about less than 8,000, so a ratio of 2.2. If we go look at the top 10% of men who are employees in their late 60s, they're still 45,000 a year. Women is only less than, the top 10% of women who are employees are only earning less than 20,000, 19,000, so ratio 2.4. We look at the top 1%, you've got even greater difference. But the important thing here is that the dispersion is greater, the range is greater. So we compare the top 10% of employees, men, lowest 25%, you've got a ratio about 6-fold, top 1%, lowest 25%, 15-fold, and so on. When we look at the same thing for income from self-employment, we actually get even greater inequalities. So self-employment might be great, but it's incredibly unequal. So a quarter of women who are self-employed in the late 60s actually have an income of less than £3,000 from self-employment. So they might as well not bother, basically. Well, they should bother, but it's a very, very tiny amount. And for men, it's about, under 6,000, so it's still a ratio of 2-fold. But the top 10% of people who are self-employed, for men are getting an income of 53,000 from self-employment. So we've got a ratio of about 10-fold between the top 10% of men self-employed in the late 60s and the lowest quarter of men. And similarly for women, the top 10% of women compared with the lowest 25% of women in self-employed. So very, very unequal, and very, very unequal between men and women as well. So if we compare the top 10% of men self-employed, lowest 25% of women, you get a ratio of nearly 20 different. So it's a huge, huge inequality. So this is just kind of summarising these and looking at the same ratios, but in each case, if we compare, top with lowest and men, women, and so on and so forth, the largest inequality or dispersion is for self-employment income. So self-employment income is very, very unequal in the late 60s, and I've looked at it for other age groups. It's more unequal in the late 60s than at any other age during the life course, that level of inequality of self-employment income. And women's income from each source is around half or less than half that level, and from employment is even lower than half than that. So my conclusion really is here is that late life employment may be great, but actually it's magnifying gender inequalities and other sorts of inequalities in income. So just kind of conclusion, my first sort of exemplar is that changes in pension and employment policies in the UK, which encourage older people to work beyond 65, they're great, but the nature of jobs, employee jobs, are often precarious, often part-time, but they may be good if you can carry on in the same university professor role. That's great. Also, self-employment is high, but self-employment is incredibly diverse. We shouldn't just talk about self-employment because it's very, very, very different in nature. Both employment and self-employment are strongly related to health, and being employed in the late 60s or self-employed is much more likely if you've got a degree than for the more educated. And the income inequalities are large in later life and larger from employment at this life stage than at earlier stages in the life course. So I think what my conclusion really is that self-employment and employment in the late 60s or above 65 actually increases inequalities and leads to cumulative disadvantage, and that gender income disadvantages increase with age. I think we also need to look at the conclusions in terms of gender and generation and the interconnections, firstly, of inequality between generations. So that the extent to which we're seeing greater income inequality in later life is likely to magnify inequalities earlier in the life course. So as we know, for young people, it's very, very difficult to get in the housing market, cost of education and so on. Parents in their 60s who've got more income, much more likely to give money to their children to allow them to buy a house, help them not get huge educational debt and allow them to start families and so on and so forth. So I know that from my own personal view, because my children, I actually have supported them getting houses, but some of their friends in their early 30s, their parents are divorced, they're both partners have got degrees, but they cannot afford to buy a house. And that's delaying their possibility of childbearing and so on and so forth. And it's simply because their parents just don't have that income in later life to support them in the housing market. So the financial support of the older generation to assist house purchase and education of younger generation is highly income related, and that is likely to become greater, that inequality, as income inequalities through working longer kind of kick in. The second sort of factor is between gender and generation. The older generation women increasingly support daughters' paid employment by providing grandchild care, but this may constrain their own active ageing and their own ability to work and reduce their own pension income. And so we can see that women actually are less likely to work than men, and caring responsibility is important. And again, midlife women providing elder care for their parents-in-law may constrain their own employment and reduce their own future pension income and financial well-being. Right, I want to completely go off onto another tack, and that is looking at sleep and health. So sleep is under-researched by social science, and I find that very surprising, because sleep, we all spend a third of our lives, roughly, asleep. And if we don't sleep one night, we might feel a bit grotty the next day. If we don't sleep every day for a week, you know, we're going up the wall. I mean, we really are, you know, stressed, ratty, can't function properly, and so on. So sleep is fundamental for well-being and health. So why aren't we studying it more? Also, sleep is part of everyday life, and therefore it tells us more about everyday roles and relationships, about gender and so on, which I have written about, not going to talk about today. There's a lot of evidence over the last 5-10 years of the adverse consequences of lack of sleep. We all know that it's a major cause of accidents, you know, car accident, nuclear accidents, all the rest of it. It's a cause of falls among older people, and that then, you know, constrains them and costs the health service, blah, blah, blah. But it's also, sleep is terribly important for cognitive functioning. Lots of research studies showing important for children. You know, you take an hour off a week of sleeping for children for 2 weeks, and their cognitive ability, their behaviour declines, their learning declines. You give them an extra hour of sleep, and actually they do better on tests and all sorts of other cognitive things. So we actually, and in later life, that's equally important as well. A lot of longitudinal work showing that we all know that sleep is related to depression, but actually that sleep problems often predate depression. It's not that depression leads to bad sleep. It's actually that the causal relationship of actually bad sleep actually leading to depression as well. Obviously it goes both ways, but that's very important. So again, a lot of longitudinal studies have shown that lack of sleep, particularly under 6 hours sleep a night, and poor quality disrupted sleep, is associated with higher levels of mortality, especially from coronary heart disease and related diseases and so on, and obesity and various other things and so on. And experimental work has shown really categorically the physiological link between short sleep and chronic ill health. So you give people less sleep, their liver doesn't function as well, their immune system deteriorates, they're more likely to, glucose kind of doesn't get used properly and leading to obesity. So one of the factors in obesity is actually poor sleep. So sleep is important for health is the message. So, but you've got both things going both ways, but not necessarily in the same people, that short sleep duration, poor quality sleep, shown clearly is associated with high levels of mortality and poor health. But also if people have chronic ill health or disability from whatever cause, then that chronic ill health, pain, disability may lead to lack of sleep as well. So you've got some bidirectional relationships there going between health and sleep, and they need to kind of really look at those and the value of longitudinal studies, particularly Understanding Society, for looking at those bidirectional relationships. And it would be even more valuable if Understanding Society asked sleep questions every year rather than only wave 1 and wave 4. So that's kind of important. Okay, We could have an analogy with inequalities in health research. Again, I've done inequalities in health research for 30 odd years, on and off, and 30 years ago nobody was doing it until Peter Townsend and various people came along. But we could do equally similar work to look at the magnitude of inequalities in sleep as we do for looking at inequalities in health. So look at for which groups are there greater inequalities in sleep by class, gender, ethnicity, nature of working, and we've done some of that and others are doing that as well. Looking at the causes of inequalities in sleep, we need to look at ways of reducing inequalities in sleep, health policy implications of inequalities in sleep. So we know all these things about health and health inequality, but we know much less about these factors in relation to inequalities in sleep. So we need to analyse inequalities in sleep quality, short sleep duration with USOC to look at these kind of various kind of causal factors and relationships and so on. And obviously we can look at, with USOC, all these things, looking at household circumstances, socioeconomic factors, impact of partners, again, that's terribly important, and my colleague Rob Meadows has done some work on that, is that sleep actually is often a kind of household or a family co-sleeping. So what is the impact of partners or partners' unemployment on wives' sleep and health and so on? So we can look at with USOC the impact of that whole family context of sleep and sleeping arrangements, but I don't think USOC asks whether people sleep together, because that's terribly important as partners. Do people co-sleep or they sleep separately? And when you're older, that's much more acceptable than when you're younger. And then obviously things like worries, money, material circumstances and so on, and sleep, and physical health, psychological health and so on. So USOC allows us to analyse the relative importance of a whole range of these factors, not all of them, but a very large proportion of them simultaneously in terms of impacting on quality of sleep and length of sleep, and then obviously how that may relate to health. So what I want to just, as this exemplar, talk about one particular study. The second study here we published in one of the Understanding Society, I think the first wave report, and that we looked at much more socioeconomic inequalities in sleep and sleep quality and duration in that article. But I want to talk more about this second article, which Rob Meadows, my colleague, is the first author and main writer on, which is forthcoming in the Journal of Health and Social Behaviour in September, which looks at marital status, relationship distress and self-rated health, and what is the role for sleep problems. And in this particular paper and study, we're using wave 1 data on sleep, and the self-completion module includes 7 sleep items, and we're analysing about 37,000 people aged 16 or more who completed the sleep module. When we're thinking about marital status and health, it's very well known that married people have better health and lower mortality than non-married people. But we need to understand much more about those mechanisms between marital status and health, and including looking at the meaning of marital status in much more nuanced way than is often done. So the research questions in this paper, we're looking at not only marital status, but amongst those who are married or cohabiting, what is their relationship quality? So we kind of tend to see married as a box, but actually if you're in a bad marriage, a bad relationship, that may have very different impacts on your health and on your sleep, and sleep as a mechanism. So we're kind of subdividing that and looking at marital status and relationship quality, how that links to health, and how marital status relationship quality links to sleep, and to what extent sleep mediates the link between marital status and relationship quality and health. So one of the things we want to look at is clearly it's important to separate out cohabitation, living together, from legal marriage, because they may be quite different rather than lumping together. And often the non-married get lumped together, either in one category or never married versus previously married, but again, differences amongst the previously married, differences in marital trajectories and so on. And the separated clearly are maybe quite different in terms of their health and stress and so on and so forth in terms of marital conflict compared with a divorce, and obviously widowed may be different again and so on. So the value of Understanding Society is large sample sizes, robust analysis for small subgroups, so you can look at divorced men, separated women, cohabiting women and so on. You've got enough to actually do that in detail. And obviously there are questions about relationship quality. So the marital relationship quality measures there are various items on marital relationships in USOC. We're looking at 4 items which loaded together on one factor. And in the self-completion questionnaire, the question was, please indicate, this is for married and cohabiting people, please indicate for each question which best describes your relationship with your partner. You know, consider divorce all of the time, most of the time, down to rarely never. Regret getting married all of the time, most of the time, down to rarely never. Quarrel, get on each other's nerves all the time, rarely never. So hopefully you'd expect most people to have a low score because they say all of the time, apologies, other way around. You expect most people to have a high score because they should say rarely never, or perhaps occasionally they quarrel, and so on. So we did quite a lot of analysis on this and found that the have I got this right? I've got this, yeah, lower, yeah. We're looking, I've got this lower. Okay, those who've got medium or high relationships distress were the lowest. We looked at the lowest third, and they had a score of less than 20. So they're more likely to be saying, you know, most of the time or more often than not, and so on. And we called that medium or high relationship distress, compared with 2/3 of the sample who had little or no relationship stress with a score of 20. So that's how we're separating it out. So within that, we've got 8 different categories. We've got those who are married with little or no relationship stress, and that distress, that's the majority, 12,500. Married with high or medium relationship distress, 4,500. Cohabiting with no little relationship stress, cohabiting with high relationship distress, then the never married, then the separated but legally married, which is 614, then the divorced and the widowed. So we're looking separately at all of these categories, basically. And self-rated health is the normal sort of look at scale from excellent to poor. We analyse the linear scale. Just looking at some of the kind of basic results. Self-rated health score, we're just adjusting for age here. The score of the married with no or little relationship distress is the best, 2.38. That's on a 5-point linear scale. Those with cohabiting and high or medium relationship distress, 2.73. So considerably worse and significantly worse, and worse than the married with high relationship distress. Single and never married, kind of somewhat in between, not too good, their health. And the divorced with the worst health there. So perhaps what you'd expect. On the sleep data, we used 3 of the sleep items to create a sleep problem scale, which we standardised. Sleep latency, unable to get to sleep within 30 minutes on a 5-point scale. Sleep maintenance, waking during the night or early in the morning, not be able to get back to sleep again. And sleep quality, which is a kind of, a typical sort of self-rating of sleep quality, very good to very bad. As we know, women report worse sleep on each measure, and we combine them together, as I said, into a standardised scale. If we look at this sleep problems, sleep as a standardised sleep scores, by far the best sleep is married with no or little relationship distress. So hugely best. So actually, if you're married with a good relationship, your sleep is great. So that's good. So minus 4.41. If you're cohabiting with high or medium relationship distress, your sleep is really pretty bad. Much worse, 0.53 on standardised score. Single, never married, kind of pretty much average. It's fine. And widowed, not too bad either. This is age adjusted. The divorced and the separated, again, very poor sleep. Particularly those who are separated have the worst sleep of all, of everybody. And to some extent that might kind of, make some kind of sense. So what we then look at is mediation analysis, series of linear regression equations, all of them adjusting for age squared, education and ethnicity, looking at the total effect of marital status on health, then the direct effect of marital status on health while controlling for sleep problems, and then the magnitude of the indirect effect of marital status, relationship quality on health via sleep problems, and to what extent the total effect is mediated by sleep. And we also look at to what extent those indirect effects differ for men and women. This kind of summarises some of the kind of the key findings, and what we're doing is here is looking at deviations from what we might see as kind of reference category, the married with no or little relationship distress. So the best group. So how much worse or how much greater is the impact of sleep problems in mediating the relationship in marital status, relationship quality on health, and find that the particularly substantial direct effects on health are for the cohabiting who are in relationship distress, and the divorce is the highest values. And when we look at the indirect effect via sleep, that's the indirect effects, and what just calculated here is the percentage of the total effect which goes via sleep. And that is particularly substantial for people who are married but have a poor relationship, that sleep is actually a key mediator in terms of their poorer health. Also cohabiting, but not quite so great. And for those who are separated again, and in fact for the widowed as well. So sleep is actually an important mediator between marital status and health, but primarily for people who've got relationship distress and the divorced and the separated. So to draw some conclusions from my second exemplar, married people in happy relationships have the best health and the best sleep. The divorced and those cohabiting with relationship distress have the poorest health and the poorest sleep. And I think we need to be looking at thinking through the positive impact of co-sleeping. In a good relationship, it's very positive, but actually if you're arguing with your husband, partner all the time and things aren't good, then actually co-sleeping is actually really quite problematic. So sleep is really badly affected, affected by marital relationship quality. So for those in unhappy married and cohabiting relationships, for the separated and the divorced, the mediating role of sleep is substantial. And then we found that the mediating role of sleep is significantly greater for divorced women than for divorced men, and that was the only significant gender difference. So for divorced women, it's particularly problematic, their sleep, and that is a kind of mediator between their marital status and their health. Okay, my final exemplar, and I'll be a little bit quicker on this. I want to look at sleep, caregiving and ageing, and that merges my previous research interest in caregiving, which has done a lot on ageing and sleep, and again illustrates, I think, hopefully the power of understanding society to combine previously unconnected areas of social scientific work. So sometimes things you haven't really thought about, you can look at in USOC because it's there, but it wasn't there because people planned to put it there to look at these things. But actually, if you think about it, you can do it. So hopefully this is a kind of example of some work which people might not have thought about. So caregiving, sleep and stress. So we all know from miles of work is that caregiver roles lead to stress, burden, and so on, and potentially residential admission. But one of the key issues is to what extent poor sleep of caregivers is actually a factor leading to higher levels of stress, burden, and residential admission. So sleep may be important in terms of policy sense, because actually if people, from our qualitative work, we can see that people who actually have got really intensive caregiving, which is problematic at night, just kind of, they talk, I couldn't cope anymore, I had to go to the doctor, and the doctor said, I think you're going to have to put her into care home because you're just not, functioning at all, and it's really, really problematic for you. So poor sleep is kind of can be a key mediating factor. So caregiving and sleep, there's been a vast literature on caregiving, and I've contributed to it, as many people have. Vast literature on caregiving for frail, older, disabled, and younger people. Much of it is focused on tasks and roles, the effect of the sort of caregiver roles, performance of physical tasks, personal care, intimate care, emotional support, and so on. A lot looked at the effects of caregiving on the carer, disrupting particularly women's work, restricting their leisure, stress, burden, psychological well-being, health consequences. So there's been loads of work on caregiving. But what is extraordinary is there's virtually no work on the effects on sleep of caregiving. It's almost entirely neglected. And this is extraordinary because caregiving often happens at night. If you're caring for somebody with Alzheimer's disease, they're up at night, they're disoriented at night, you're going to be, disturbed by them, you're going to be checking on them and so on. And if you're caring for somebody with pain or needs medication and so on, it affects you in sleep. So caregiving is 24/7 often, but we haven't really looked at the impact of caregiving on sleep, on the sleep of the caregiver. So we've done loads of qualitative work on this, and a couple of publications, qualitative work, Journal of Aging Studies and Sociological Research Online, looking at caregiving at night in standing effect on carers. So we've shown particularly the effect of intensive caregiving on the sleep of carers. But the issue really is, can we also identify the effects of caregiving on sleep of carers quantitatively? And there's been a relative lack of large-scale surveys which have asked questions on sleep and on caregiving and on the whole range of social and health variables and so on, apart, of course, from Understanding Society, which allows you to do that. So the measures of caregiving in Understanding Society, co-resident caregiving. The question is there anyone living with you who is sick, disabled or elderly who you look after or give special help to? And the proportion who provide co-resident care are about 6% of people in 45 to 64, almost 10% of people over the age of 65. And then there's a question on non-resident caregiving. I'll say now, non-resident caregiving, caring for somebody in another household doesn't affect your sleep. Well, that's kind of reassuring, but co-resident caregiving does. And then for those who provide any co-resident care or care for somebody in another household, USOC asks number of hours caregiving a week. As we know, women are more likely to be carers and they provide longer hours of care, particularly more than 20 or more than 100 hours a week. I don't think I'll show that, but I'll just show it very quickly. So clearly gender and caregiving vary across the life course. So the proportion of caregivers, co-resident carers, actually is the highest for women in their late 60s. They're caring for their partners largely, their spouses. The highest likelihood for men caregiving is when they're over 75, over 85, they're caring for their spouses as well, and they're younger. So it's a kind of age thing going there. So actually, very old men actually who are married are often caregiving. Non-resident caregiving, there's a different sort of life cost profile. I won't show those two. Right, so here we're just analysing Understanding Society, Wave 1 data, examining the links between poor sleep and gender and age, marital status, caregiving, co-resident, non-resident, various socioeconomic variables, health and so on. And particularly want to look at the associations in later life between these factors and compare it with those working age, and I'll go quite quickly. So logistic regression of those reporting 2 or more sleep problems and some hierarchical models here, which I'll just show you. So if we just look at firstly at those working age 20 to 64, so these are people who are if they're providing, the reference category is people who don't provide any co-resident care, right, for caregiving. And if you're 20 to 64, if you're providing more than 100 hours care a week, your odds of poor sleep are twofold, about 2, compared with not providing any co-resident care. So much higher likelihood of poor sleep for working age people who are caregiving compared with non-caregiving. And women are more likely to have poor sleep than men. But actually when we put in education, work status, other sorts of socioeconomic factors, that becomes much more moderated and less association. If you put in health and chronic illness, it's non-significant. So that's kind of important. When we look at over the age of 65, you get a different sort of pattern in terms of you don't get mediation by education, work, health. And for those who are over 65 and caregiving, if you're doing a short amount of co-resident caregiving, less than 20 hours or even less than 100 hours a week, your sleep is not adversely affected compared with those with no co-resident caregiving. But if you're caregiving more than 100 hours a week, really, 24/7 sort of caregiving, an odds ratio of about 2.5 of poor sleep compared with either short hours of caregiving or non-co-resident caregiving. But when we control on education, health and chronic illness and so on, that doesn't change that relationship at all for older people. So what we've actually got here is there are different mechanisms by different age groups. So for the younger working ages, there's a strong association with co-resident caregiving and poor sleep. The more co-resident caregiving you give, the poorer your sleep. But actually that's mediated by non-employment and those factors. So when you're working age, if you're caregiving, you don't work. Obvious, you're not working, and you have lower finances, and you often have poorer health as well, and those are the factors which lead to poor sleep. So co-resident caregiving is still important, but actually it's a different sort of mechanism. It's leading to people having to leave the labour market or not be in the labour market because of caregiving. Whereas when we look at the over 65, of course, who are not largely in the labour market, co-resident caregiving at that stage is largely married caregiving, whereas working ages, it might be caring for a disabled child or a partner, or, all sorts of things. So for over 65, co-resident caregiving is largely caring for a spouse, and if you care for over 100 hours a week, your sleep is much, much, much poorer. But it's not because of mediated by health or socioeconomic status or anything like that. So actually, the kind of policy message is for older people, actually sleep is important and we need to be looking at it because it does, intensive caregiving can have a major impact on sleep and so on. So what we show from the quantitative data is there's a significant effect of co-resident caregiving on sleep quality, and particularly for older, that may lead to greater stress, burnout, potential residential care home admission and so on. But for working ages, greater hours of caregiving are associated with poorer sleep quality, but this is partly because co-resident carers are less likely to be in paid work and the financial and other stresses that this entails, leading them to have poor sleep, per se. Whereas amongst older co-resident caregivers, only very intensive long hours of caregiving, 100 or more hours a week, in other words full time, is linked to very significantly poorer sleep with an odds ratio of about 2.5. And as we know, women are more likely to undertake long hours of co-resident care and have their sleep adversely affected. So I think what I would kind of argue is that there's more need for research to look at caregiving, how caregiving at night impacts on health and well-being of carers. So my overall conclusions now is really the importance of understanding society for cross-sectional analyses as well as longitudinal. This is especially because of the very large sample sizes, and you've got ethnic groups and so on, which you can look at in detail and so on, which I haven't here. But so very large sample sizes provides robust big enough samples for small subgroup analyses. Very wide range of variables which you can creatively put together in ways people haven't thought about before, including things like sleep, caregiving, marital relationship quality, and so on and so forth. Obviously the strengths of adding the biodata, particularly to sleep and health analyses, which I haven't looked at here, but there's potential there. And obviously where you've got modules repeated across waves, like sleep in waves 1 and 4, and marital state quality in waves 1 and 4, that allows analysis to change over time. But obviously it would be nice to have some things like sleep questions asked annually to be able to look at much more longitudinal analysis. So really my final sentence is that USOC is an invaluable resource with massive analytic potential to answer key theoretical and policy questions of our time. So just acknowledgements, firstly thanks to Understanding ISER, University of Essex for permission to analyse Understanding Society. Thanks to some research funders, EU and New Dynamics of Ageing programme, and thanks to my co-researchers, particularly Rob Meadows, who may be here, I don't know. He's giving a paper tomorrow on more detail on sleep and kind of inequalities, and also Suven Emmanuel Bianchera. So thank you very much for your attention.